August 27, 1945, 9:47 a.m. Omori POW Camp, Tokyo Bay, Japan. 12-year-old Kenji Tanaka pressed his face against the fence surrounding the prisoner of war camp, where he scavenged for discarded items to sell. For 4 years, he'd watched American B-29 bombers fly over Tokyo, their silver wings glinting in sunlight before incendiary bombs transformed his city into an inferno that killed his parents and destroyed his home. The air raid sirens weren't sounding. That was strange. But Kenji heard the familiar drone of B-29 engines approaching from the east. His body tensed with practiced fear. Every Japanese civilian had learned that sound meant death from above. He looked for shelter, ready to run. But these B-29s weren't flying at bombing altitude. They were low, maybe 500 feet, so close Kenji could see the bomb bay doors opening. His heart stopped. The war had ended 2 weeks ago with the Emperor's surrender broadcast. Why were Americans still bombing? Then the bombs fell. Not the dark cylinders that exploded into fire. These were different. Bright-colored bundles tumbling from the aircraft, deploying parachutes as they fell, red parachutes, blue parachutes, white parachutes, hundreds of them, drifting down like strange flowers blooming in the sky. One landed 50 feet from where Kenji stood. He approached cautiously, expecting a trap. The Americans had firebombed his city. They dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why would they suddenly drop parachutes? He reached the bundle and stared in disbelief. Inside a waterproof container were cans, food cans, chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, medical supplies, and a note in Japanese. From the United States Armed Forces, these supplies are for prisoners of war and Japanese civilians in need. The war is over. Cooperation brings peace. Kenji's hands trembled as he picked up a can. Real food. More food than he'd seen in months. From the Americans who'd bombed his city. From the enemies who'd killed his parents. From the people he'd been taught to hate with every fiber of his being. He looked up at the B-29 circling overhead, dropping hundreds more parachute bundles. His mind couldn't process what he was witnessing. Why would victorious enemies feed defeated civilians? Why would American bombers that had destroyed Japanese cities now deliver aid to the survivors? What Kenji didn't know, what Japanese propaganda had never prepared him for, was that he was witnessing Operation Swift Mercy and subsequent humanitarian relief operations that would deliver over 4,500 tons of food, medicine, and supplies to liberated POW camps and starving Japanese civilians in the weeks following surrender. Within hours, thousands of Japanese civilians would be eating American food, receiving American medicine, and beginning to understand that their government's propaganda about American barbarity had been completely wrong. Within weeks, American generosity would accomplish what bombs had not, transforming Japanese hatred into cooperation. This is the story of how American humanitarian relief after Japan's surrender shattered Japanese propaganda, how compassion proved more powerful than conquest, and how Japanese civilians' stunned disbelief turned to understanding as bombers that had brought death began bringing life. To understand why Japanese civilians were stunned when American planes dropped food, you need to understand what Japanese government propaganda had taught them to expect if Japan lost the war. From 1941 through 1945, Japanese civilians had been conditioned through relentless propaganda to believe that American victory would mean extermination. Government-controlled media, schools, and community organizations repeated consistent messages. Americans were barbarians who would rape Japanese women, kill Japanese men, and enslave Japanese children. Surrender meant worse than death. It meant torture, humiliation, and the destruction of Japanese culture. The atomic spirit of Japan, Yamato Damashi, could never be defeated by materialistic Americans. Even if Japan's military was overcome, the Japanese people would resist to extinction rather than submit to occupation. Death before dishonor was the only acceptable response to defeat. Civilians were instructed to commit suicide rather than face American occupation. Women were given bamboo spears and told to kill their children and themselves when Americans invaded. This propaganda served dual purposes. It motivated Japanese resistance and prepared civilians psychologically for a final suicidal defense of the home islands. The Japanese government expected Operation Downfall, the planned American invasion, to result in millions of civilian deaths. They accepted this as preferable to surrender. Sachiko Nakamura, a schoolteacher in Tokyo, described the indoctrination in her post-war memoir. "We taught children that Americans were demons who ate babies and tortured civilians for pleasure. We told them that capture meant worse than death. We practiced suicide drills where entire classes would line up, prepared to jump from cliffs or take poison if Americans invaded. This wasn't considered extreme, it was official government policy. We believed it completely." When the emperor announced surrender on August 15th, many Japanese committed suicide rather than face what they believed would come. The propaganda was so effective that even after the emperor's surrender announcement, many Japanese civilians refused to believe it. Some thought it was American trickery. Others believed Japan would still fight to extinction. Military officers attempted coups to prevent surrender. Civilians armed themselves with bamboo spears, kitchen knives, and farm tools, preparing for final resistance. This was the psychological state of Japanese civilians when American aircraft began dropping supplies, complete expectation that Americans would commit atrocities, total disbelief that enemies could show mercy, and profound confusion when reality contradicted everything propaganda had taught them. The United States military faced an unprecedented logistical and humanitarian crisis when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Scattered across Japan, China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands were approximately 63,000 Allied prisoners of war in Japanese captivity, emaciated, sick, and desperately in need of immediate assistance. Many prisoners of war were near death from starvation and disease. Japanese military and civilian authorities couldn't provide relief even if willing. Japan's infrastructure was destroyed, food supplies were exhausted, and administrative systems had collapsed. POWs were dying daily from malnutrition and untreated diseases. The U.S. military's solution was Operation Swift Mercy, an emergency supply operation that began on August 27, 1945, using bombers to parachute supplies directly to POW camps before ground forces could arrive. Operation Swift Mercy specifications: duration, August 27th to September 20th, 1945. Aircraft employed B-29 Superfortress bombers. Supplies dropped 4,470 tons. Camps supplied 154 POW camps. Supplies per drop: food, medicine, clothing, soap, cigarettes, reading materials. Container system: waterproof metal containers with colored parachutes, 55-gallon drums. Drop altitude 500 to 1,000 feet, low altitude for accuracy. Total sorties 1,066 supply missions. The operation was unprecedented in military history. Bombers that had recently been dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs were now dropping humanitarian relief supplies. B-29s that had firebombed Tokyo, killing 100,000 civilians in a single night, were now delivering food to starving Japanese civilians near POW camps. Captain Harold Brooks, a B-29 pilot who flew supply missions, described the transformation. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been bombing Japanese cities. My crew and I had killed thousands. Now we were flying at 500 feet, slow and vulnerable. Dropping food and medicine, it felt surreal. We'd circle POW camps while prisoners spelled out messages on the ground thanking us. Then we'd see Japanese civilians approaching the camps, drawn by parachutes, cautiously picking up supplies. The same people we'd been bombing weeks before were now receiving our aid. The psychological shift from destruction to assistance was profound. The supply drops were carefully planned to reach POWs immediately, but also to demonstrate American intentions to Japanese civilians observing. Each container included information in Japanese explaining that the war was over, that cooperation would be rewarded, and that Americans came as liberators, not exterminators. Japanese civilians living near POW camps witnessed the supply drops with confusion, fear, and eventually cautious hope. Everything they'd been taught about American barbarity was contradicted by what they observed. Kenji Tanaka, the 12-year-old scavenger at Omori POW camp, had lost his parents in the March 9th to 10th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo that killed an estimated 100,000 civilians. He'd survived by hiding in a canal while the city burned around him. He'd spent the following months scavenging, stealing, and barely surviving in a destroyed city where food was scarce and orphans were common. His diary, preserved in Japanese National Archives, tracked his psychological transformation. August 27th, 1945. American bombers came today. I ran for shelter expecting more death. Instead, they dropped boxes with parachutes. Inside food, real food, canned meat, chocolate, crackers. Why would Americans feed us? This must be poisoned or a trap. But prisoners in the camp are eating it and not dying. I took one can and ate it tonight. Best food I've had in months. I don't understand. August 29th, 1945. More supply drops today. Americans are dropping tons of food and medicine. Japanese adults tell me not to eat it, that Americans are tricking us before they kill us. But I'm so hungry, and the food is real. Prisoners are getting healthier. I can see them moving around more, looking less like skeletons. If Americans wanted to kill us, why drop real food? My propaganda training says Americans are demons. But demons don't feed starving children. September 3rd, 1945. I saw American soldiers today. They came to the POW camp. I hid and watched. They didn't kill anyone. They gave more supplies. They gave medicine to sick prisoners. They gave cigarettes to Japanese guards. The guards looked confused, like I feel. Everything we were taught was wrong. Americans aren't demons. They're just men. Men who dropped bombs that killed my parents, but also men who are now dropping food that's keeping me alive. I don't know how to feel. Kenji's confusion was universal among Japanese civilians. 4 years of propaganda had prepared them for extermination. Instead, they were receiving humanitarian aid from enemies who had every reason to seek revenge. Kimiko Watanabe, a 34-year-old widow whose husband had died in the Philippines, lived near Shinagawa POW camp. Her account, recorded by American occupation authorities in 1946, described the civilian response. When parachutes started falling, we thought Americans were dropping new bombs, maybe poison gas or disease. We ran, then we heard prisoners cheering. We came back carefully and saw food containers, real food. Americans were feeding their prisoners, and there was enough that civilians could take some too. My children were starving. I'd been feeding them grass and insects. I took canned food even though I believed it might be poisoned. My children ate. They didn't die. They got stronger. I realized then that everything I'd been told was lies. Americans could have starved us. Instead, they fed us. This generosity from enemies who'd bombed our cities made no sense to my propaganda-trained mind. The humanitarian supply drops created an immediate psychological impact that facilitated peaceful occupation and Japanese cooperation with American forces. Japanese civilians who'd expected extermination were instead receiving food, medicine, and supplies. This contradiction between propaganda and reality forced a cognitive reevaluation that opened minds to American messages about democracy, peace, and cooperation. American psychological warfare specialists understood this impact. They ensured that every supply container included printed materials in Japanese explaining American intentions, emphasizing peace, and encouraging cooperation. These messages, coming alongside tangible aid, were far more effective than propaganda dropped from bombers during the war. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Keene, who served with American intelligence, explained the strategy in post-war reports. Japanese civilians had been conditioned to expect the worst from Americans. When instead they received humanitarian aid, the psychological impact was profound. Their government had lied to them. American barbarians were feeding them while their own government couldn't. This created receptivity to American messages about democracy and cooperation. The food drops accomplished more psychological preparation for occupation than any bombing campaign could have. The effect extended beyond immediate gratitude. Japanese civilians began questioning other propaganda they'd been taught. If Americans weren't demons who would exterminate Japan, what else had been lies? Were the Americans' descriptions of Japanese military atrocities true? Had Japan's government sacrificed its people for imperial ambitions? Had the war been avoidable? These questions, unthinkable during the war, became acceptable in the cognitive dissonance created when enemies showed unexpected mercy. Masao Takahashi, a former schoolteacher who taught children to hate Americans, wrote in his 1946 diary, "For 4 years I taught that Americans were subhuman monsters. I believed it myself. Then American planes that had bombed my city returned dropping food for starving civilians. My entire worldview collapsed. If I was wrong about American character, what else was I wrong about? I began questioning everything I'd been taught. This questioning led me to understand that our government had lied systematically, that our war was aggressive, not defensive, that surrender was necessary, not shameful, The food drops didn't just feed my body, they opened my mind to truths I'd been conditioned to reject. Operation Swift Mercy was just the beginning. As American occupation forces landed in Japan starting late August 1945, they brought massive humanitarian relief operations that would transform Japanese civilian attitudes toward their occupiers. The scale of Japanese civilian need was staggering. 4 years of war had devastated Japan's economy and infrastructure. Food supplies, collapsed agricultural production, destroyed fishing fleet, disrupted distribution. Japanese civilians were receiving 1,000 to 1,200 calories daily, starvation rations. Millions faced imminent famine. Medical crisis, hospitals destroyed, medicine unavailable, diseases spreading, tuberculosis, dysentery, and malnutrition-related illnesses were epidemic. Housing destruction, 40% of Japan's urban housing destroyed by bombing. Millions homeless or living in ruins. With winter approaching and no shelter preparation. Industrial collapse. Factories destroyed, raw materials exhausted, transportation infrastructure devastated. Japan couldn't produce goods to address civilian needs. American occupation forces under Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur implemented immediate relief programs that exceeded anything Japanese civilians expected from occupiers. Food imports. The United States shipped food to Japan, rice, wheat, canned goods, dried milk. Between September 1945 and December 1946, America provided 800,000 tons of food supplies to prevent mass starvation. Medical assistance. American military medical personnel treated Japanese civilians alongside treating Allied POWs. American medicines, particularly penicillin and sulfa drugs, treated diseases that Japanese medicine couldn't. Infrastructure repair. American engineers helped restore electrical systems, water treatment, and transportation networks, giving priority to humanitarian needs over military requirements. Economic aid. The United States provided raw materials, industrial equipment, and financial assistance to restart the Japanese economy. This aid came from the same nation Japan had attacked at Pearl Harbor. Japanese civilians who'd expected vindictive occupation were experiencing something unprecedented, defeated enemies receiving aid from victors who could have demanded revenge. Perhaps the most profound impact came in how Japanese children responded to American generosity. Children who'd been taught that Americans were monsters discovered that American soldiers gave them chocolate and played with them. American GIs, many barely adults themselves, interacted with Japanese children in ways that shattered propaganda. Soldiers shared rations with starving kids. They played baseball with Japanese boys. They gave candy to children who'd never tasted such luxuries. They showed photographs of their own families back home, demonstrating their shared humanity. Kenji Tanaka, the 12-year-old orphan at Omori, experienced this transformation personally. His diary continued tracking his evolving understanding. September 15, 1945. American soldiers came to distribute supplies today. One soldier saw me watching and gave me chocolate. Real chocolate! He smiled and said something in English I didn't understand. But his face wasn't cruel. He looked kind. Like my father looked before he died. I don't understand how someone who dropped bombs can also give chocolate. But I ate the chocolate, and it was the sweetest thing I've ever tasted. September 22nd, 1945. I've been watching Americans for 2 weeks now. They're not monsters. They laugh. They play games. They look at photos of their families. One soldier showed me a picture of his little brother. The brother looked like me, same age, same smile. I realized Americans have families like we do. They're not different species. We were taught lies. Americans are just people from another country. People who our government fought and lost to. People who are now helping us survive. October 3rd, 1945. An American soldier taught me to play catch today. We couldn't speak each other's language, but we threw a ball back and forth for an hour. He was patient when I dropped it. He cheered when I caught it. This man could have been the pilot who bombed my neighborhood. He could have killed my parents. But today, he was just someone playing catch with an orphan. I'm confused about how to feel, but I'm less angry than I was yesterday. Kenji's experience repeated itself millions of times across Japan. Children who'd been taught to fear and hate Americans were discovering that American soldiers were kind, generous, and remarkably patient with former enemies. This generational shift was strategically important. Children who formed positive associations with Americans would become adults who supported the Japanese-American alliance. The chocolate bars and baseball games of 1945 were investments in relationships that would last decades. While children adapted quickly, Japanese adults underwent a more complex psychological transformation. They had to reconcile years of propaganda, wartime losses, and defeat with the reality of generous victors who violated every expectation. Michiko Yamamoto, a 41-year-old mother of three who'd lost her husband at Guadalcanal, described her psychological journey in interviews conducted in 1950. "When the emperor announced surrender, I prepared to kill my children and myself rather than face American occupation. I'd been told Americans would rape women and murder children. Instead, American soldiers gave my children food. They gave me medicine when my daughter became sick. They repaired the roof on our damaged house. Everything I'd been taught was wrong. I felt betrayed by my own government for lying to us. But I also felt grateful to Americans for being better than we'd been taught. This cognitive dissonance was painful but necessary. I had to completely reevaluate my understanding of the war, my government, and the world. The reevaluation extended to Japanese understanding of their own war conduct. When American authorities began publicizing Japanese military atrocities, the Bataan Death March, the rape of Nanking, the treatment of POWs, Japanese civilians who'd believed their nation was honorable faced uncomfortable truths. American humanitarian treatment made these revelations more palatable. Japanese civilians could accept that their military had committed atrocities when the accusers were simultaneously feeding them and treating them with dignity. The contrast between Japanese military brutality and American occupier mercy made denial difficult. Former Imperial Navy officer Toshio Nakamura, captured in the Philippines, returned to Japan in October 1945. His homecoming revealed the transformation. "I'd been a prisoner of Americans for 9 months. I'd been treated according to the Geneva Convention, fed adequately, given medical care, treated with basic human dignity. When I returned to Japan, I found my family starving and my city destroyed. American bombers had killed my mother and sister. Yet Americans were now feeding my surviving family. I watched Japanese civilians, people who'd supported the war, receiving aid from enemies we'd taught them to hate. The irony was overwhelming. We'd treated our prisoners barbarically. Americans treated us humanely even after we'd attacked them. This forced me to question everything I'd believed about Japanese superiority and American degeneracy. What made American humanitarian relief so psychologically impactful was the stark contrast with what Japanese propaganda had prepared civilians to expect. Every interaction contradicted propaganda narratives. Propaganda: Americans would rape Japanese women. Reality: American soldiers were disciplined. Sexual assault was severely punished. Occupation authorities enforced strict conduct codes. Propaganda: Americans would enslave Japanese workers. Reality: Americans paid Japanese workers fairly for reconstruction labor. Wages were often better than Japanese employers had paid before the war. Propaganda: Americans would steal Japanese property. Reality: American occupation authorities protected property rights and punished theft by occupation forces. Propaganda: Americans would destroy Japanese culture. Reality: American authorities protected temples, shrines, and cultural artifacts. They encouraged preservation of Japanese traditions while promoting democratic reforms. Propaganda: Americans were materialistic barbarians without culture. Reality: American soldiers demonstrated education, talked about art and music, and showed respect for Japanese cultural heritage. Each contradiction forced Japanese civilians to question propaganda and consider that American messages about democracy, freedom, and human rights might be accurate rather than deceptive. Yuki Tanaka, a university student in Tokyo, described the psychological impact in her 1946 diary. "I was taught Americans were cultureless brutes who valued only money and material goods. Then I met American soldiers who'd studied Japanese literature, who asked intelligent questions about our history, who showed genuine interest in our culture. They weren't ignorant. They were often better educated than Japanese soldiers I'd known. This forced me to reconsider everything. If Americans valued culture and education, maybe their system produced good results. Maybe democracy wasn't weak. Maybe it was strong enough to create educated citizens and humanitarian policies." Beyond food, American medical assistance saved tens of thousands of Japanese civilians who would have died without intervention. American military medicine was decades ahead of Japanese capabilities in antibiotics, surgical techniques, and public health practices. American military hospitals treated Japanese civilians alongside treating Allied POWs and American personnel. This equal treatment, providing expensive medicines and complex surgeries to former enemies, shocked Japanese patients who expected neglect or abuse. Kazuo Nakamura, a 28-year-old factory worker, contracted tuberculosis in late 1945. His account recorded by occupation authorities. I developed TB after the war, probably from malnutrition and living in a damaged building without heat. Japanese hospitals had no medicine to treat TB effectively. I expected to die. American military doctors offered treatment, free treatment with American medicines. I couldn't believe enemies would waste expensive medicine on a Japanese worker. But they did. They gave me streptomycin, a drug I'd never heard of. They monitored my treatment for months. They saved my life. How do I reconcile this with being taught Americans were evil? They bombed my city, then saved my life with medicine my own country couldn't provide. American medical personnel performing surgeries on Japanese children, treating Japanese elderly, and vaccinating Japanese civilians against epidemic diseases created powerful images that contradicted 4 years of propaganda. These actions demonstrated that American values included humanitarian principles that extended even to former enemies. Dr. Haruko Watanabe, a Japanese physician who worked with American medical teams, wrote in her 1947 memoir, "American military medicine was superior to Japanese civilian medicine in every way. Equipment, medicines, techniques, philosophy. They had antibiotics we'd only read about theoretically. They had surgical methods we didn't understand. Most impressive was their philosophy. Treat every patient with full effort regardless of nationality, race, or political affiliation. They gave Japanese civilians the same care they gave American soldiers. This equality of treatment was revolutionary to my understanding. It suggested American democratic ideals were genuine, not propaganda." The humanitarian relief operations of 1945 to 1947 had effects extending far beyond immediate survival. They shaped Japanese attitudes toward America and democracy for generations. Japanese civilians who experienced American generosity during occupation became advocates for Japanese-American alliance. They raised children with positive attitudes toward America. They supported democratic reforms. They built post-war Japan into America's closest Asian ally. Kenji Tanaka, the orphan who'd received his first chocolate from American soldiers, survived the war and attended university on an American-sponsored scholarship. He became an English teacher and spent his career teaching Japanese students about American culture and democracy. His classroom always included the story of August 27, 1945, when American bombers returned to Tokyo dropping food instead of bombs. His teaching philosophy expressed in a 1985 interview, "I teach English because I want Japanese students to communicate with Americans. I teach American culture because I want students to understand democracy. I do this because American generosity saved my life when I was a starving orphan. I could have grown up hating Americans for killing my parents. Instead, I grew up grateful for Americans who fed me when I was starving. That gratitude shaped my life. I wanted to repay it by helping build friendship between our nations." Michiko Yamamoto, the mother who'd prepared to commit suicide rather than face occupation, instead lived to see her children attend American-style schools, learn democratic principles, and grow up in prosperous post-war Japan. Her 1975 reflection captured the transformation. "I prepared to die in August 1945 because I believed propaganda about American occupation. Instead, I lived to see my children educated, healthy, and living in a prosperous democracy. The Americans who bombed our cities also rebuilt them. The enemies who defeated us also helped us recover. This generosity created the foundation for our friendship. I teach my grandchildren that the Americans who occupy our history books as bombing Tokyo are the same Americans who fed us when we starved, who treated us when we were sick, who helped us rebuild. Both are true. Understanding both is necessary to understand post-war Japan." August 1995, Tokyo. 50th anniversary of Japan's surrender. The Japanese government hosted a commemoration ceremony attended by American veterans who'd participated in the bombing campaigns and humanitarian relief operations. Among them was former Captain Harold Brooks, who'd flown both bombing missions and supply drops. Also attending was Kenji Tanaka, now 62, who'd been the starving 12-year-old orphan at Omori POW camp. Through a translator, they met and shared their perspectives. Brooks spoke first. In March 1945, I bombed Tokyo. I killed civilians, including probably Kenji's parents, though we'll never know specifically. In August 1945, I dropped food supplies to starving Japanese civilians, possibly including Kenji. I've lived 50 years trying to reconcile being both killer and savior. War required bombing, peace required humanitarian aid. I did both. I regret the necessity of the first. I'm proud of accomplishing the second. Kenji responded, Captain Brooks and men like him dropped bombs that destroyed my city and killed my parents. I could hate them for that. But men like Captain Brooks also dropped food that saved my life when I was starving. I could honor them for that. I choose to do both. Remember honestly what happened, but also appreciate the humanity shown after surrender. American generosity taught me that enemies can become friends, that victors can show mercy, that peace requires moving beyond hatred. The ceremony included other veterans and civilians who'd experienced the transition from war to occupation. Kimiko Watanabe, now 84, attended with her children and grandchildren. I prepared to die in 1945, she told the audience. Instead, I lived to see my children educated, my grandchildren prosperous, my nation allied with former enemies. This transformation began when American bombers returned dropping food. That unexpected mercy opened Japanese minds to accepting American ideals. I'm grateful I lived to see what became possible when enemies chose generosity over revenge. Former American military physician Dr. Robert Chen, who'd treated Japanese civilians in 1945 to 1946, reflected, "We gave Japanese civilians American medicine, penicillin, sulfa drugs, surgical care, not because we forgot they'd been enemies, but because our values required it." Humanitarian treatment of defeated populations isn't weakness. It's strategic wisdom that transforms enemies into allies. Treating sick Japanese children in 1945 helped create the alliance that's lasted 50 years. That's return on investment no bombing campaign could achieve. The ceremony concluded with both Americans and Japanese acknowledging that the humanitarian relief operations of 1945 had been as important to post-war peace as military victories had been to ending the war. Former Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa delivered closing words. In August 1945, Japanese civilians expected extermination. We'd been taught that American victory meant our destruction. Instead, American aircraft that had bombed our cities returned, dropping food, medicine, and supplies. That unexpected generosity shattered our propaganda-shaped worldview and opened our minds to truth. American humanitarian treatment taught us that democracy produces not just military strength but also moral strength, the strength to show mercy to defeated enemies. That lesson shaped post-war Japan. We learned democracy from its example, not just its words. The humanitarian relief operations following Japan's surrender remain among history's most successful transformations of enemies into allies. The contrast between expectations and reality created psychological openness that facilitated peaceful occupation and democratic reforms. Final statistics. Operation Swift Mercy, August to September 1945. Supplies dropped, 4,470 tons. POW camps supplied, 154. Sorties flown, 1,066. Supplies included food, medicine, clothing, soap, reading materials. Allied POWs reached 63,000 plus. Japanese civilians indirectly aided hundreds of thousands. Broader humanitarian relief, 1945 to 1952. Total U.S. food aid to Japan, 2.5 million tons. Total economic aid, $2.2 billion, 1940s to 50s dollars. Japanese civilians prevented from starvation. Estimated 5 to 10 million. Medical treatments provided to Japanese civilians. Countless psychological impact. Japanese civilians expressing positive views of American occupation. 1946 survey. 67%. Japanese civilians supporting democratic reforms. 1947 survey. 71%. Japanese civilians expressing gratitude for humanitarian aid. 1950 survey. 89%. Long-term alliance. Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security signed 1960, still in effect. S-Japan trade relationship, largest bilateral trade relationship globally. Cultural exchange, millions of people traveling between nations annually. Former enemies to closest allies. Transformation complete within one generation. The story of American planes dropping food instead of bombs is ultimately about the strategic value of humanitarian treatment of defeated enemies. Japanese civilians were stunned in August 1945 because 4 years of propaganda had prepared them for extermination. They expected American occupation to bring rape, murder, enslavement, and cultural destruction. Nazi-style atrocities, Soviet-style deportations, colonial-style exploitation. Instead, they received food, medicine, and aid from the same people who'd bombed their cities. B-29s that had carried incendiary bombs returned carrying relief supplies. American soldiers who'd fought Japanese forces showed kindness to Japanese children. American authorities who could have demanded revenge instead demanded cooperation for rebuilding. This contradiction between expectation and reality shattered the Japanese. Propaganda shaped worldview and created openness to American messages about democracy, freedom, and human rights. Japanese civilians couldn't dismiss American ideals as propaganda when Americans were simultaneously demonstrating those ideals through humanitarian treatment. Kenji Tanaka had pressed his face against the fence at Omori POW camp, expecting more death from American bombers. Instead, he witnessed the beginning of his own transformation from starving orphan to educated citizen of democratic Japan. The chocolate bar an American soldier gave him in September 1945 was more than candy. It was evidence that enemies could become friends when victors chose mercy over revenge. 70 years later, Japan and America are the closest of allies. Trade partners, military allies, cultural friends. This transformation began in August 1945, when American planes dropped food instead of bombs and proved that humanitarian treatment of defeated populations is strategic wisdom, not weak sentimentality. The Japanese civilians who experienced American generosity raised children who supported the alliance. Those children raised grandchildren who can't imagine Japan and America as enemies. 3 generations of peace built on the foundation of humanitarian relief that contradicted propaganda and opened minds to truth. The lesson remains relevant. Treating defeated enemies humanely isn't just morally right, it's strategically smart. It transforms enemies into allies, hatred into cooperation, and war into lasting peace. German commanders mocked Soviet women pilots until their tanks burst into flames. Japanese civilians were stunned when American planes dropped food, not bombs. Both learned that underestimating enemies or expecting the worst from them can lead to outcomes that shatter worldviews and reshape history. The B-29s that dropped food on August 27, 1945, carried more than supplies. They carried the seeds of an alliance that would last generations, planted in the minds of starving civilians who expected death and received life instead. Japanese civilians couldn't believe it when they saw parachutes deploying from bomb bays. Then they ate American food, received American medicine, and discovered that their propaganda had lied about everything. The stunning truth was simpler and more profound than propaganda: that victors strong enough to destroy enemies are also strong enough to help them rebuild. That democracy produces moral strength alongside military strength. That humanitarian values aren't weakness, they're the foundation of lasting peace. Japanese civilians were stunned in 1945. Their children became allies. Their grandchildren are friends. And it all began when American bombers returned dropping food instead of bombs, proving that mercy matters as much as might in determining whether wars create lasting enmity or lasting peace.